The first question was, what Jewish leaders established their power during this period, and what techniques did they use against their major rivals? Remember, before the exile, there were three power groups. There were the kings and the court, there were the prophets who claimed to speak for Yahweh directly, and there were the priests who managed the formal worship of Yahweh through a temple in Jerusalem, but also other shrines in other places at different times and periods, depending on whether the king was a supporter of multiple gods or only one god. So who came out on top among those three? Do you remember?
Priests.
Right. The priests, specifically the Zadokite priests in Jerusalem, who claimed you couldn't worship anywhere else. So that was a nice plus for them to put not only to put all the prophets and the kings out of business, but they put the other priests out of business too. So they had the monopoly. The kings were eliminated by the Babylonians, in conquest, rebellion, the battle of empires. And the prophets were marginalized with a clever maneuver by saying that we already had the best prophet who ever lived. His name was Moses. And he wrote down in a book all you need to know. In fact, if you're a later prophet, we have to check what you say against what Moses wrote in the book to see if you're even telling the truth. Otherwise, it's fake news. So they managed to marginalize the prophets as well. They also were able to get out the belief shortly after they established their power that prophecy had ended, so that there were no more new prophets. And even later writers, 100 or 200 years later, who wanted to claim prophecy had to put their prophecy in the name of someone who had lived before that end of prophecy date. It's called pseudepigraphy, or ascribed writing, where you write it but claim that Joshua wrote it or Moses wrote it or Abraham wrote it, because then someone will actually read what you're trying to say. So the prophets were maneuvered out of a job, and the priests were all that were left. Next question. What were some of the most important new developments in Jewish history during this period?
The publishing of the Torah.
Yes, the final editing of the Torah from previous sources and its final compilation and presentation to the people, as we read about in Nehemiah chapter 8. Other details?
Well, the disappearance pretty much of Israel and the what do you call it? Judah becoming into the forefront and becoming the center.
Right. Although Israel was conquered in 722 BCE, so it's a century and a half earlier than the exile to Babylonia and the return. Sure. So they've been gone for a couple hundred years. But of course, their peasantry was probably still there. Just like the Judean peasantry stayed when the elites were exiled to Babylon, but they were delegitimized by the returners with their Torah. One example of this is which mountain at the end of Deuteronomy is blessed and which one is cursed. There is a group based in the northern part of the old heartland, around a city now called Nablus, which in ancient times was called Shechem. And there, this group called the Samaritans still lives. They offer sacrifices in the old way, and there's about 6,000 of them, maybe 10,000. They have a Torah scroll too, but their Torah scroll ends with Joshua. It's a hexateuch. It's got 7 books in it. So their Torah ends in the land, not outside of the land, waiting to enter. And there are subtle changes in the text, including at one point near the end, Moses stands on one mountain and blesses another mountain and curses a second mountain. But the question is, which mountain is blessed and which mountain is cursed? Is it Mount Zion or Mount Gerizim, which is in Nablus Shechem? In the Samaritan Torah, it's Mount Gerizim that's blessed and the southern mountain that's cursed. But in the Judean Torah, or the Jewish Torah that we have now, Gerizim is cursed and the one in Judah is blessed. Now, because there are 16 million Jews and 16,000 Samaritans, we claim ours is correct. But, one could make an argument that theirs might be just as old, or an alternate version at a different time. And they obviously adopted it from those priests coming back from Babylon, but there was some argument between the two communities. And so the Samaritans may have been descended from those Israelites in the north, not the elites, or from Judeans who had stayed and not gone into exile, but they became antagonists to the Jews. And this is why, by the way, the parable of the Good Samaritan is what it is, because the Samaritans, according to the Jews, were terrible people. And the Good Samaritan was the exception, who helped a Jew who was in trouble on the side of the road. So it was the altruism of the Good Samaritan that makes the parable in the Jesus narratives in the Gospels. But you have to know who the Samaritans are to get the perspective. As one scholar I know put it, for most Judeans, the only good Samaritan was a dead Samaritan. So.
You asked about significant developments. Was this the time where they were purging and purifying the population that had remained in Judah and Israel, and they were there was a movement for men to divorce their non-Judean wives, and there was a lot of population movement because some of the men wouldn't do that. So
Absolutely.
there's a lot of unrest there, I think.
Yes, and that may have also been one of the splits between the Samaritans and the Judeans because of the inmarrying with the surrounding peoples. Yes, that's absolutely presented in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah as well, as part of that return imposition. And the whole concept of having a holy seed that needs to be preserved separate from the surrounding peoples appears in the book of Ezra, and again gets carried on from there.
The whole idea of a people remaining separate and not mingling with the neighbors is something that, you know, the idea has not entirely gone away yet, that this is a very Jewish thing to do, is to remain separate in marriage rather than out marriage.
Exactly. And despite the stories in the Hebrew Bible in the first parts of the Torah that do describe blending with other peoples, Joseph marries the daughter of an Egyptian priest, for example. But in later generations, there's this editorial strain of not liking the intermarrying, and eventually a ban on that in Deuteronomy, and of course in later history.
Well, Solomon and David.
Right. I mean, again, they can't erase the history. They have to admit it at times, but they don't like it. And in fact, they blame Solomon's marrying out for leading him astray and worshiping other gods and all those terrible things. It must have been his wife's fault. Well, we also have the absolute monotheism of Yahweh taking over in this period, where you don't really have a lot of polytheistic practice after this time. In fact, one of the interesting examples of this, I just saw an article today in Haaretz, which is the Israeli equivalent of the New York Times, about an archaeological mystery, why ancient Hebrews made figurines of naked women. And this style of a woman holding her breasts up like this is very, very common. And the question is, are these fertility goddess statues, when most statues of goddesses were not made out of poor clay material like this? Was this simply a magical device? And is it even necessarily identified with women? One of the scholars who presented at a conference about this pointed out, just because you find something in a home doesn't mean it's automatically identified with women, because we've discovered recently that men lived in homes too. So just because it's a female figurine doesn't mean that men might not have used it for fertility purposes or for magic purposes or who knows what. But that kind of figurine is often found broken in troves by this period, or simply not around anymore because the absolute monotheism has been more firmly established.
I'd also add the centering of Jerusalem is a big change, because I mean, from having lots of various cities with temples and sanctuaries and all that, to you have one capital that rules them all is quite a shift. Absolutely.
Also notice that you have both centralization to Jerusalem and dispersion, because some Jews didn't come back from Babylon. They create the first diaspora of choosing to live outside of the land, but still feeling attached to that land, longing for Jerusalem, going on pilgrimages there. But that's new. That's something that didn't exist before. Before, to be Judean was to be in Judea, but now they're being Judean even outside. Also notice a change in empire. It's not the Babylonians anymore, it's the Persians. And the Persians bring with them a new empire language known as Aramaic. In fact, the Hebrew letters we're familiar with reading as Hebrew are actually Aramaic letters originally. The old style Hebrew is more like a chicken scratch alphabet. It's a little bit harder for us to read. And the letters we're used to reading as Hebrew letters are Aramaic letters. Because there are no Arameans anymore, we can call them Hebrew letters. But originally they came from Aramaic. And that became the daily language of Jews by the Roman period, such that when Jesus is quoted in the New Testament, he's quoted speaking Aramaic, because that was the daily language of Jews. Okay, next question. What might have been some of the theological consequences of the conceptual shift caused by the priestly declaration of the end of prophecy? Once they say prophecy's over, what kind of ripple effects does that kind of declaration have?
I'd say a big one is it's much harder for your religion to move with the times. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons Quakerism tends to be more socially progressive, because the idea is that everyone can have sort of a conversation with the divine that's essentially equivalent to biblical teachings, which means when people start going, oh, you know, you shouldn't stone gay people, that becomes just as theologically justified as let's stone all the gay people, because they're not tied to, there is no more really revelation. And so when you had prophets, you could update.
Well,
Right.
it
Go
also
ahead.
centralizes the power into the priest's hands. I mean, to continue what she's saying, and it eliminates other sources of potential truth, so that the only truth comes now through the priests. And so now the priests become the layer between the regular people, and they're the ones that have to interpret the Torah now for the regular folks. And it really centralizes everything within them, and it becomes a very rigid system as a result. But it changes the power structure quite significantly.
And they also become the intermediaries between the God and the human being. So the human being doesn't approach God directly,
Right,
or offer the sacrifice directly. You need a priest in between,
right.
a buffer and filter. And we'll talk a little bit more about that.
It's very Catholic of them.
Yeah. Well, or it's very Jewish of the Catholics. I mean,
Catholic.
you know, you got to think about it historically too. Also, there's an interesting parallel, because the centralized authority of the priest and the high priest reflects the centralized authority of a monotheism. You know, if you have one God, it makes sense that you have a political and religious structure that has one head of the church or head of the temple. Whereas when you had many gods, the idea of many shrines made perfect sense. If you go down to one God, then you get one temple, then you get one high priestly structure. It sort of reflects the realities out there. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, that modern theology is often much more decentralized, with God as a spark in every human being, or God as a force in the universe, like the force of freedom, or the democratic power that's in every individual citizen who can vote. You know, the politics sometimes impacts the theology. It's not always the other way around. And so, you know, the idea of a king God who rules absolutely is hard to sell in a democratic era. And so often the theology may adjust to fit the setting. One other thing that becomes important as we go through this period much later, if the only source of divine communication then is either what the priests tell you or what he wrote in the book, then if there becomes a broader understanding of literacy as a positive value, then reading the book can become a holy act, and interpreting the book can become a new kind of prophetic act too. So this leads us, we can see, into the rabbinic world of study and Torah study and Talmud study and Jewish law discussion and all of that as positive religious duties, as serving your God, and as, in fact, discovering new things that the God implied in what was written so many centuries ago. So reading and interpreting now become a holy act, not just fulfilling the commandments of offering the animals as the priests have told you to do. Again, this requires broader literacy, and it requires more publishing of these books. And this is pre-printing press, so you know it's handwriting. It takes a long time. But by the time of the end of the Second Temple period, by let's say the year 0 or 100 BCE, you'll even get communities dedicated to writing these scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls community is one example. In Qumran had actually what they called a scriptorium, a room dedicated to writing and copying scrolls. That's what they did, because this was God's word, and so we need to explore it more and more as a religious act. And they were so far from the temple, they wouldn't have gone to the temple for daily sacrifices, but they could use the book instead. And so that's an important theological shift too. Number 4 talks about the first few chapters of Genesis and how that demonstrates multiple authorship, which we talked about, the focus on the number 7 and going from chaos to order sounds more like a priestly story, and the anthropomorphic God who forms the man from the dust of the ground and breathes life into him, and has a magic rib to create a woman, and a magic tree with eternal life and the knowledge of good and evil, and talking snakes, and all the origin stories is a more sort of mythological version. And the shift in divine names is one of the clues, because in chapter 1 is just Elohim, who in an abstract way, like the divinity, just says, let there be light. Whereas in chapter 2, verse 4 and following, you've got Yahweh Elohim, who is a specific Yahweh of the gods, who is much more hands-on and walking in the garden and saying, where are you, Adam? And all kinds of other things you'd think of in a Zeus-style mythological story, rather than an abstract commanding God story, which is more priestly oriented. Now, the next question I think is really important. Reform and conservative rabbis are taught the basic elements of academic biblical criticism, yet it rarely, if ever, is taught in their Sunday schools, or it doesn't affect their religious practice. They still say, when they take out a Torah scroll, this is the Torah that Moses placed before the children of Israel, from the mouth of God by the hand of Moses. But what they've learned in rabbinical school is what we've talked about, this documentary theory. So why do you think this is the case? And why has secular humanistic Judaism taken a different tack on that question?
I suspect a big one is that being too honest about it leads to too much cognitive dissonance and leads to more people becoming atheists and humanists rather than the theists that the official reform and conservative leadership officially deems appropriate theological belief. And I'm guessing that probably is a great percentage of it. Is just if you talk too much about it all being written by humans, people might start questioning why you still believe that, God exists and is at all what we're talking about, if we already know that a lot of the things that he's supposed to have done, he didn't do.
Okay, other thoughts?
Yeah, the history that we think happened, that we think is closer to what really transpired, that was discovered within the last few centuries. So there was a huge tradition of accepting everything that was passed from the beginnings as things started developing and coalescing. There was a huge tradition. And to come in just because some people are doing research and writing and contravene that, especially when you're a marginalized population, is not going to be an easy sell. So I think there might have been some you go along to get along.
I think part of it is also that the people in the synagogues are used to the old language. They know the melodies, they know the old blessings, is what they've always done. And to change that would be a challenge, and you have to change a lot of stuff, not just to take the Torah out blessing.
Right, but and that's my point. There was a huge tradition, and just because something is being new and maybe getting acceptance in academic circles, how do you bring that into a place where it is so steeped in tradition, including the melodies and including the artifacts and everything? You don't just come in. When would the change have happened in any sort of a graceful, acceptable way? There's an inertia.
And also, don't forget, everyone around you, at least until the last couple decades, believed it was by Moses via God also. So even if your academics are telling you this in the 1870s and 80s, the surrounding population is convinced that this is the word of God by the hand of Moses. And so do you really want to be, you're already a minority community anyways, do you really want to be the radicals who are undermining Mosaic authorship of the Torah?
And I was very surprised. I was invited to a conservative bar mitzvah a few years ago, and the new conservative siddur had footnotes, commentary essentially saying biblical criticism.
Yep.
I mean, it was there right in the Siddur.
In the footnotes.
Yeah, in the footnotes.
Okay. Well, that's the thing. Is it in the footnotes? Is it in the back of the prayer book? Is it, or does it actually change the words that you're going to say in public? You know, that's where the rubber hits the road. Does it change what you teach in the Sunday school? You know, there's that famous episode I've mentioned earlier in the class where a conservative rabbi at his congregation said the Exodus didn't happen the way it says in the Bible, and everybody's got flipped out. And I said, well, you never laid the groundwork for this, because you're still saying this is God's Torah. This is the Torah of truth. And so you gotta prepare them, or you gotta be consistent and carry it through. And that's something that we've chosen to do, because our approach is the people can handle the truth, right? We're not going to say you can't handle the truth. I don't dare say it out loud. And we're willing to say it in services. We're willing to say it in Sunday school. We're willing to say it in an adult ed class, as well as in rabbinical school.
And I will say with regards to, you know, changing of the liturgy and stuff, I mean, the Reform movement did change the literature. I mean, if you talk about in the 1800s, they did huge radical changes, but even today they update and they change things somewhat. So that which makes me think that it's not entirely just an unwillingness to change tradition, and there are things that are like considered okay to get rid of, and essentially things that are not.
This is different because often Reform liturgy editing, which is a longer discussion, is by cutting, but not by changing. Most of the changes they made were editing out, cutting out things. They didn't often go in and radically change stuff. And because the Torah scroll, the Shema, the Kaddish, like these are the big like signpost pillars. Those are the things that they've tended not to change as much. There's even a trend now to move back in a more traditional direction. They've brought back in the resurrection of the dead as one phrase, for example, in the newest Reformed prayer book that had been cut out 150 years before. Because they decided that was primitive, but now it's come back. So, you know, the pendulum shifts the other way. I think Lori was trying to get into.
I just wanted to say that, you know, when you have faith is not subject to questioning in that sense. So what we look at these things as a rational exercise of, you know, if something comes up and contradicts what we think already, well, okay, you know, we can take that and change the way we look at it because we're approaching it from a disciplinary sense. But when you have faith in something, this is what I believe. Then it becomes something where you suspend, in effect, your questioning to it, which means that you're not going to start questioning, well, the Exodus didn't happen because of this, that, and the other. No, I accept it on faith, and it had happened because I accepted that it happened.
Yeah.
This is like coronavirus.
Well, a little bit.
You know, you accept it or you don't accept it, you know, and you wear a mask or you don't wear a mask.
Well, and our approach generally is let's face reality, and we can deal with reality. In fact, that's probably a healthier way to approach things, be it COVID or the history of the Torah. And also, I'll point out, and Rich, I'll get you in a second. I'll point out that in many ways, the history that we can reconstruct based on this critical approach to the text is much more supportive of our mission of being creative and expressing Jewish diversity and talking about the evolution of Jewish life. You know, we're not the ones who are saying we're doing this just because it's traditional. If we want to do a tradition, we can, but we're not doing it only because it's traditional. And so pointing out how much tradition has changed, that those figurines with the woman holding the breast, that was Jewish too. That's, even if we don't want to build our own, it's still worth it for us to highlight that was a Jewish practice at one time, so that our changes are not the first changes ever. In fact, it's changed the whole time. Yeah, Rich, go ahead.
I think this touches on one of the fundamental reasons that secular humanism is a minority of an already minority. My observation is most Jews that I know are secular, but they don't need to practice it. They to the extent they need to identify as Jews and practice Judaism a couple times a year, is all about tradition. They don't, it's not an intellectual activity. It's from the heart, from the memory. And they don't want, when they go in a temple, they don't want to hear things that aren't what their grandfather taught them.
Yes, it's like colonial Williamsburg, where they're historical reenacting, or you know, honestly, it's singing the old melodies that you knew growing up, or that you were taught, or you got drilled into you. And It has a kind of verbal muscle memory to it, a ritual memory to it. And so they continue to, to live in that practice. And, asking those deeper questions or making changes to be intellectually consistent is less important to them than having that traditional feel. And honestly, it's just simpler if you act like they really happened, and instead of having this subtle distinction between, well, this is a story and we find the literature important, but it didn't really happen. And, that's a little like, level 2 complexity there. And some people just like the level 1 version of this is what happened and this is the story. And that's all. I don't want to get into the ifs, maybes, possibly. The evidence suggests 60%. That's not going to work for them. And so the last question, and then we have to actually start today's class, is why is the issue of the Torah origin so important for secular humanistic Jews? And the honest answer is, this is what really happened as best we can construct it. It gives us the context for where these stories came from. Reading literature requires some context. Knowing when Shakespeare lived and what was happening around him is vital to understanding what he's talking about and why he's writing the way he is. It can be timeless too. You don't have to only read it from historical lenses, but that's an important way to understand the stories. And understanding the diversity of the sources that made up the Torah itself means that there's always been many Jewish voices that have been combined into one Jewish teaching or message or generation. And so we're part of that chorus. Some may find us atonal and not like our contribution to the group chorus, but we find our voice important to include. And, this helps us explain why some texts are confusing. And honestly, it gives us a little ammunition if we need it, in case somebody says, well, the Torah is perfect, so how could you be a secular Jew? You could say, well, maybe not. Maybe not.
I think that's really important. There are certainly the voices that would claim that our movement and our stances are not Jewish, are not justified. And it helps to have the ammunition to know that Judaism has changed and evolved and wasn't always what that particular person thinks it's always been and always will be. Even if they don't accept it, we get a certain kind of sustenance and support knowing that we have our stance and some sort of background to back it up. It's very helpful, especially as a minority voice, or as you say, a minority within a minority within a minority.
Right.